Yeah, I think we'll start now. Okay, so this is part 2 of the internal language of commodities. Last time I presented a lot of stuff. I thought it wasn't super clear, and maybe this one won't be that clear either. There's just so much technical material that I'm currently engaged with, and it's difficult to separate what is truly useful to us separate that from what just seems interesting and kind of, very powerful on a technical level, but not necessarily expressive of what we're trying to do. And I was really inspired by Renzo's last presentation, because I really felt like he just went for it and like really tried to formalize specifically the types of problems that we were interested in the group. And I think the formalism he presented kind of followed from the problem rather than the other way around. That being said, though, I think it's still important to like make connections with existing literature on the topic. So I mean, at least in this presentation, I still try to do that, but hopefully it works. So again, yeah, if there's any questions, just stop me in the middle. I try to be more cursory in the technical stuff, so that we can have more room for conversation. Okay, so the 3 parts of the presentation will be the recap of last time, because it was a month ago. And then we'll talk about temporal type theory, which is this very interesting paper that I uploaded to the website. We won't be going over most of it. I just wanted to give you all a taste of how it works. I think you can fit an intuitive explanation of it into this presentation, but obviously there's a lot of technical details that don't matter at this stage. And then part 3, I wanted to use ideas from the last presentation and this temporal type theory to revisit the idea of composition with regards to capital. So it's kind of going to be a recap of what is in the primer, the latter chapters of the primer, but applying some of these ideas. So don't worry if you haven't read the primer. I'll just start from scratch. Yes, and also I have a kind of a bombastic claim to make in section 3 about the value form. So we'll leave that. Okay, so recapping last time, really, I think there's 4 things to take away from the last presentation. The first is that we can use category theory to investigate social relationships. And I gave this little technical jargon for it. Basically, you have these objects, which are in some sense social formations or social objects of a kind, right? You can see in this picture, A and B would be those social objects. And then you have these social relations between them, which broadly construed is just logical statements that you can make about those formations. And I think another way you can think of it, which I will investigate more in this presentation, is that these social statements that you make really should be thought of as constraints on social formations. So social formations are not, subjective things. They're embedded in material conditions, right? There are certain things that you can say about a family or a city or a country that is grounded in the material needs of the people involved, or certain history of who owns what and who has the power to say, to do what with what resource. So these are constraints that you can't just they're not part of like culture necessarily, although cultural constraints can also be formalized in this framework. But yeah, I think thinking of these social relations in terms of constraints, that's what I want to talk about today. And then the other thing about category theory, the reason we want to use category theory is that it is the best tool for understanding composition. So this idea that a single social formation is not only an individual thing, it's composed of many other social bodies. And those social bodies are composed of other social bodies. So there's this whole unpacking that we can do anytime we see something in society, right? We can unpack it to a certain degree, right? Until we get to the level that we care about, right? There might be things that below that level that we could go and elaborate on further, but for the purposes of this type of causality or this type of constraint, we only care about a certain level. So at the level of families, for example, you may not care about the individuals within that family and what their situations are. You may want to treat the family as a unit. Then you can start to compose these families together to form, communities. And you can examine certain phenomena like quarrels between families, the debt of a family to another family, for example, and things like that. But you may not actually care about what is going on at the individual level. So that's the first part, right? Why we want to use category theory. The second part, I'll go up here to, so this text that Gabriel and I wrote called the primer, it advanced this claim among many claims, but one of the main claims is that the logic of capital is inherently compositional. And we can use category theory because it's the tool for examining composition, right? So this diagram here shows how the formula of capital, Marx's famous formula, money producing a product, right, by buying labor and materials, or means of production, and then producing a product and then selling that product, right? That sequence that is the fundamental form of capital can, instead of being thought of as like a temporal sequence, it can be thought of as a logical sequence, basically. So this diagram captures that. It's a commutative diagram, which is how you can look at relationships within a category. And then down here in the last presentation, I also, I think maybe the most confusing part of the about that conversation was the relation between topology and value. So I basically wanted to say that there is this internal language to a category, which is kind of this logical interior that is not so much about what we say or what we perceive about capital, but it's about what capital itself is able to express with its own language. And this is ultimately in the language of commodities themselves, right? So commodities themselves, they don't understand things like time necessarily. They don't understand things like rates of change. So we need a certain topology to supplement this language in order to draw further relationships between commodities. So I added this on, and I observed that this topology isn't something we just added, out of nowhere, but it's inherent to the structure of money, right? Money itself has a certain topology that mimics things like time and space, right? We call it the homomeric property. and then Marx calls it the formal use value. So it has some special property that allows us to formulate new expressions within this category we've set up. And then finally, the last thing I ended with in that presentation was this crazy picture and idea that we could examine capitalist accumulation using topos theory. Specifically, there's one kind of topos that is kind of famous, called sets varying in time. So that's basically like a set in the set theory, except it's parameterized in some chronological sense, so that if anytime you look inside the set, it's something different, right? Depending on what time you're looking at, right? So this idea combined with the idea of a category allows us to formulate capital as something which is expanding in time. And not only that, but it has subsets, which these subsets correspond to individual capitals, which are competing. Some of them are dying off because they're unable to survive the competition. Some of them are merging to form larger capitals. And then some of them are stagnant. All these different kind of biological metaphors for capitalist accumulation. I think a good setting for that would be this sets varying in time. Obviously, there's a lot more there that, this is just a very cursory examination of that using this formalism. So yeah, these are the 4 ideas. So now then I listened to Renzo's presentation. I was really impressed by this interactional model that he presented. So I drew here kind of what I took out of one of his slides. So namely, like this idea that in some kind of social conflict, you can actually visualize the various interacting segments of that. For example, like occupying a school, you can visualize it as having a border, right? So it has an interior, an exterior, and a border, and this border is made of the same stuff as the interior and the exterior. It's just other elements, other groups. They can be individuals, but they could also be just groups of people, or even state entities, right? Bureaucratic entities. And the reason we can do this is because of these arrows here, I think, that allow us to formalize interaction in this two-way manner. There was something that we talked about a year ago, which has the same theme, which is the idea of an open game that certain category theorists are working on, which I realized afterwards that these arrows basically correspond to the forward and backwards parts of that open game structure. And again, just like we were saying before, this is compositional, right? Like you can take the interaction between A and B and the interaction between B and C, and you can take and glue them together such that, you can now make statements about the interaction between A and C, right? There's like a transitive property going on there. So this whole thing, like if you squint at this structure, you get what I drew at the bottom right? Something like a space with interior boundary complement. And so this is kind of a nice way to zoom in and out of, I would say Renzo's presentation is like a zoomed in version where you can see the interactions happening. Whereas some of the stuff I presented last time could be construed as like a zoomed out, the stuff here with the social relations and the social, okay. And then the last thing I wanted to to revisit is this idea that the interactions between elements or between parts of a social situation, these interactions can be thought of as varying depending on where you are in the social space, right? Just like we see here, depending on if you're on the interior of this struggle, or if you're on the boundary or the border, or if you're on the outside, certain things are true and certain things are false, right? Certain things hold for you. They are constraints for you that may not be constraints for people on the other side of that equation. So based on that idea, we can say that types of interactions form what's called a sheaf or pre-sheaf on space, right? And the space can be very concrete. It can be your city. It can be, the streets themselves, right? You can basically take any kind of, actual geographical space and do this type of assignment of what interactions are valid or possible in that space. So here I will again bring up the idea of a pre-sheaf and the sheaf. I feel like every presentation I give, I have one slide talking about this definition, but as a recap, one more time, the pre-sheaf condition says that, okay, so let me take a step back. Inside this box, right, types of interactions, we have a lot of these interactions, right, many different kinds, but we categorize them in terms of types. So like, occupying a space is a type of interaction. Marching and having signs, to make yourself visible, that's a type of interaction. Clashing with the police, that's a type of interaction. So we're going to say that inside the box, you have many of these little, I think this is a phi, the Greek letter phi. We'll say each one of these phi's represents one type of interaction, right? And they all live inside of this orange box. So that just to, make this more readable. So when I say for every phi in the orange box, I'm saying, all these different little interactions that can happen. So for every one of them, there exists a psi or this green interaction inside the green box, such that when you restrict the phi interaction to the green area, and really this should be, when you restrict the phi interaction to this little green zone within the orange zone, right? So it's a sub part, it's a sub region of this larger space. When you restrict it to that region, you get this psi, right? You basically, this orange interaction and this green interaction are the same from this green zone. And that's what can be called localization or regionalization, right? So that's what a pre-sheaf does. It allows us to study localizing effects, right? Things which are happening at macro scale. When you zoom in, they may look the same as something happening at a local scale, and vice versa, right? When you zoom out, something that's happening locally may look totally different at a global scale. And then the difference between a pre-sheaf and a sheaf can be summarized as whenever you have a set of interactions, if they agree on a certain space, then there exists some unique interaction phi such that its manifestation at that restricted space is the same as your original set of green interactions. So again, a simple example, a more intuitive example would be a protest is a type of an interaction. And you could ask the question, well, is a protest the same as sitting in front of a Capitol building, right? Is it really the same thing, right? How can an individual person say that they're part of the protest if all they're doing is sitting somewhere. Well, then you can make the argument that the thing which is missing is what is your point of view, right? If you're zoomed in to just that individual sitting in front of some space, it may not look like they're doing much, right? But when you zoom out, you can say that there's an agreement, right? This part here, they agree on overlaps, right? The agreement is that if many different people can do this action, there's this kind of gluing that happens, so that at the macro scale, this tiny interaction becomes compatible with this larger interaction called having a protest, right? So this is what all this drawing is just saying, right? The yellow boxes, you could say, like, zooming in to just a small part of the protest, and then you can kind of see these larger subsets being glued along this overlap. Okay, and so this is why sheaves and pre-sheaves are interesting to me. I always bring them up because I think they apply not only to like political actions, but also to things like capitalism, which I think is one of the core innovations of our group that we talk about a lot. Is we try to treat economic phenomena as just as a type of organizational phenomenon, right? So we're trying to look for tools that apply to both, and I think sheaves are one of those things you can apply to whether it's a protest or the way a capitalist firm functions. Okay.
Dennis, can I so in an example, so can I think of the interactions as sort of like propositions, and where it's valid is sort of like a region, like a substrate where it's valid, right? So I was thinking of, so in the PreSheaf condition, you could have something like you are in the square, and the orange proposition could be like being a protester, and the green one could be like hating the police. So this means that you can restrict the protesters to those who hate the police, and you would find like the subset of everything that's in the square, which is both like a protester and like hates the police. So you can like find, I don't know, like black blocks, so you can localize hating the police inside being a protester, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that would be to say, like, it's hating the police is compatible with being in a protest. There's no conflict there. Like, you can be a part of protest and hate the police, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the whole thing, right? It's obviously there are other elements of the protest, and yeah, you're just saying that there's some kind of compatibility there. But if you are actually like one of the police, for example, then maybe you don't have that same compatibility with the protests, right? You're on the other side of it.
And the second case would be something like wearing you have like wearing black and hating the police, and then you can ask whether if there's an overlap. So there are people who wear black in the protest but not necessarily hate the police, and people who hate the police but not necessarily are in the protest. But if there is an overlap, you're saying that there is a proposition that picks up sort of like this space, so something like being an anarchist or something like that. So you're able to, so in the first condition you just localize, and the second one you can sort of like find intersections, right? Glue. Okay.
Yes, exactly. If there's some overlap here, then if we're saying this is a sheaf, then that must mean there is a super type, let's say a type which arises from gluing these two types of interactions. So if one of them is like you said, wearing black, that's also compatible with being in a protest, then there must be a glued type possible.
So the second condition, so with only the first condition, you cannot sort of relate entities too much. You can only localize them. Like what you gain in the second condition is the sort of comparison, finding what's common to stuff.
Yes, and so the problem with the pre-sheaf itself, the pre-sheaf condition is they're not necessarily consistent localizations. So localizing from those who wear black to the overlap between those who hate the police and those who wear black, that is not necessarily the same as the localization of those who hate the police to this. Let me use like this yellow box here. Let's assume this yellow box is the overlap between the black and the green box. In a pre-sheaf, localizing from the black box to the yellow box is different from localizing from the green box to the yellow box. They don't necessarily localize to the unique set of interactions. But what we want to say is that this box must be the same for both of them if you localize to this intersection.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and actually pre-sheaves might be useful to formalize disagreements in that sense, because maybe from this perspective of those who wear black, there is actually a different set of things that need to be prioritized versus those who hate the police, right? And so a pre-sheaf is kind of a weaker condition. It says that we can localize things and show that they're compatible, but we don't necessarily have a unique set of things we agree on. Whereas a sheaf condition says it must be unique. Like whenever if we both localize to the same street corner, then we agree on the same principles.
Well, can I just make sure I'm following, because like now I got a bit confused and I just want to make sure like the relevance of it is also clear.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that the let's say you started by using this metaphor of zooming, and like you have types of things and you want to, let's say, it's almost like you want to be able to use a search bar in order to find things in the space, right? So you want to select a certain type and then restrict something that exists in a space to a subset of it, which is connected to that type, right? And the pre-sheaf condition is saying that, well, if there is this, if you have a type and you have some type that when you look for its substrate, it is actually a subpart, like a region of the larger substrate, you actually learn something about the relation between the types, right? So it makes this, this connection between something that is spatial, like place, like a localization, as you said, and this types, right? But it's more on the, just on the zooming in sense of like, what is a meaningful region of a space that corresponds to some type, right? And you can already learn something about the relation between types by the fact that they are localized with some superpositions or not, right? But that's as far as you can go, because you can't reconstruct the consistency of this relation between types from the relation between the parts of the space, right? That takes the sheaving condition.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly it. I think what you could add on to the zooming metaphor is the reason you cannot get a consistent gluing is because depending on where you started off in a pre-sheaf, different zooms produce different results. Whereas in a sheaf, no matter where you are, if you're zooming into the same location, you're always going to get the same result. So with the pre-sheaf, there's a condition of where you start your search.
Like, yeah, you know what I'm not sure you think this metaphor is good, but imagine you have a kind of a powerful lens that has no set on resolution. It's just like ridiculously powerful. You can zoom into somebody's hand, into the atoms, you know?
Right.
So once you set where you want to zoom in, it will do that. If you know how to kind of type it, right? You can zoom into the molecules, to the hands, to the fingers.
Yeah.
But that doesn't, you can have, like, say, a stronger microscope or lens, which will guarantee that you're zooming in only to things that are in the same world, in the sense that it won't zoom in into an atom and then to your finger, because, let's say, the world of the atoms in your hand is not really the world of hands and fingers and nails and so on, right? It will only, let's say, filter the types that guarantee this condition of that they're glued together. So nails are in fingers, which are, you know, in the hand. Whereas going all the way to the atom, you are, let's say, zooming in into a region that is localized, but you're kind of missing, like, it's too weak in a certain sense, right? It's too free and loose. You won't be able to, let's say, recuperate back the connection between the atom and nails and fingers and hands and so on, right?
Yes, I think that's a good way to think. Yeah, there's like extra stuff. There's noise.
Yes, exactly.
In your example, yeah.
So, for example, if I'm seeing a protest and I say there are some people sitting, yeah, but the type of action called sitting down, it might be too loose and too unconnected to the meaningful interactions that make up a protest, you know, because it contains people who are sitting because they're protesting, people who are sitting because they're tired, because they are doing other things, right? So you can't really go from that type of interaction. You can't really connect it back with the other things that make up a protest. It's like going to an atom, which is a bit too much, and not really going to the fingers in the hand. Whereas if you were to zoom in and stop at an interaction like shouting a certain slogan, right? Even though it's still a specific thing, and in itself, it might not be political, that particular type actually gets you to connect with the other things that are meaningful. Do you think that makes it, is that connected to the difference that we're trying to make?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the sense of what is meaningful is the key here. Whereas pre-sheaves, you are only saying, like, actually Renzo's example from earlier, wearing black is maybe not relevant at all in a protest, right? But it's compatible because you have to wear something, right? Might as well wear something black, but it doesn't actually contribute or make any it's not really part of the consistency condition of the protest. So maybe also another thing is maybe certain other members of the protest can't really see what you're wearing, like, so in that sense, it's not even part of that world, right? So what we want to have is different viewpoints, speaking in the context of like a social, like a demonstration or some kind of social act. We want a way to glue different perspectives within that act together, which would be like the different zoom levels, right? Because even in your example with the zooming into the hand, that still presumes that there's like one point of view that's zooming in. Whereas with the pre-sheaf, we can say there's different perspectives depending on where you
actually, in reality, that's not even true, right? Because the microscope that zooms into your hand is not the microscope that zooms into an atom in your hand.
Yeah.
Like, there's actually no continuity there as well.
Yeah, exactly. So many different instruments zooming in at different resolutions. Those would be forming the little boxes and the little zones here. And then our goal is basically to glue that together in the sheaf, to say, okay, this is all looking at all these different instruments are actually looking at the same thing, right? A protest.
Yeah. And I think that also what helps clarify the other point you made is that our take on value is very much connected with the thing that allows many, many different ways of producing things to actually be composed together in a way that is socially coherent, right?
Yes, which, yeah, that's in the spirit of what Marx is trying to get at, right? With the dialectical exposition, like in some sense, dialectics is like the name for the sheaf in Hegel and Marx. It's like the one thing that stays constant throughout all these crazy changes, right? It's this one thing that kind of allows you to glue history together. But there's some problems with, we've talked about, there's some problems with the dialectic. It's not very applicable to common sense. And I think this idea of the sheaf is more coherent for our project. Yeah, so we can continue. So, all right, that's the end of the recap, right? We brought up the sheaf and pre-sheaf. So that's going to be used a lot in this temporal type theory.
Yeah, perhaps just to conclude that point, like for people who are not really fond or like habituated at all with you talking about sheaves and pre-sheaves, I think that just like this idea that, it takes some extra condition to make sure that the things you zoom in all make up something coherent when you zoom out, right? That's not a given. I think that's already the intuition that makes these things relevant, right?
Yeah, and it's important not to, I mean, in case you might be thinking like, oh, but isn't this kind of like a totalizing perspective that kind of erases differences? I think yes, but in a controlled way. Like, I'm not saying that the sheaf is necessarily how the world is structured, and that's like there is only one totalizing perspective which everything glues into. It's simply saying like for the thing you're trying to study, you implicitly have conditions on what should be left out and what should be compatible. So the sheaf is just, you can think of it as kind of a relative term, right? It's a tool you apply whenever you want to take account of different types of things under the same type. And that's depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that that can be useful. So in this case, right, we wanted a lot of things in capitalism. They're not simply done in a instant, right? They happen over time. And even the core idea of Marx, which is to identify this surplus extraction that capital is able to do with labor power, that's something that happens over time. So I think that was something missing in the previous presentation, even though kind of hinted at it with this topological structure, right? In this, from the last presentation, basically, we derived the idea of a day's value of labor power by starting with the means of subsistence for the worker in total. So imagine your entire lifetime. What does it take to keep you alive, or keep your, and really, we don't even need to stop at an individual's lifetime. It could be many individuals in several generations, right? What are the commodities necessary to enable that kind of social reproduction? To go from that macro scale, which is the scale that Marx operates in, and zoom into the individual wage, which is what you're paid for. You're paid like a day's worth of labor, or you're paid an hour's worth of your labor. We need this conception of time and intervals of time, like subsets of time. So this zooming in and out, right? That's something we would like to have, because that allows us to describe things like surplus extraction. So here, temporal type theory, we have exactly this, right? We have our base space, which is time, modeled by like the real numbers, right? And open sets of this space are intervals, right? A starting and a stopping time. So I'll give an example here. Like, let's say you're eating pasta. That's happening over a certain interval of time, right? There's a beginning and an end to that process of eating pasta. This would be one of the interactions in this box. And then we want a sense of composition, right? So we can say, okay, maybe eating pasta is part of a larger behavior that you can exhibit over a longer period of time, which is having dinner, right? So you are, the act of having dinner is not just the eating, but it's also like washing and probably cooking as well. All that together can be glued into this higher type. So exactly what we were saying in the previous example, there's this like set of interactions that some of them may agree on overlap, because now you're washing the dishes. Well, you can say, well, some people in my family are still eating. So I started washing earlier, or maybe, you know, this is part of my routine of having dinner. It still counts as having dinner. So then this agreeing on overlaps would apply here, right? This yellow and orange intervals, they have some common time period. And then there's one more note, which is to say that the same interval can have different behaviors, right? We're not necessarily saying like this time intervals, there's only one possible different ways. So this is really the basic intuition behind temporal type theory, right? There's time involved, there's types of interactions involved, and there's this idea of composing them together along matching intervals. And so that kind of summarizes the whole paper, but there's so many technical details involved that it's quite surprising how complicated it can get to make this a very consistent formalism. And really, I think there's two things they're trying to get at in the paper, which may be different from what we care about. But one of the things is they want to be able to formalize this thing in philosophy called like linear temporal logic. There's actually a set of different languages to describe you know, events in time. That's I think it stems from philosophy more than mathematics. But they wanted to create what they call like a big tent, you know, a single formalism that can be restricted to these different philosophical languages for describing time and things occurring in time. And I think they succeed, right, in at least formalizing a large part of these languages. So I think it's very interesting. It's like a very powerful and broad language, but it can be finely tuned to describe very specific cases of things happening in time. Okay, and here they introduce two types of gluing, which kind of correspond to what I've presented previously. Daniel, do you have a question?
I'm wondering if you have a theory of behavior, or if it's not necessary.
Yeah,
articulate a theory of behavior.
Yes, that's a good question. So yes, I think their notion of behavior is really from a scientific kind of engineering standpoint. So for them, behavior is just a signal that can be read into some measuring system. So behavior, like if we're talking about, for example, like an airplane, the behavior of an airplane is basically anything you can measure about the airplane as it's, you know, taking off, flying, and then landing. And obviously, like coming more from the humanities standpoint or more from the political view, like not everything that we would count as a behavior is necessarily things that are measurable. Although I think with objective phenomenology, it doesn't really matter as much, because even if something isn't being measured, you know, phenomena still have some status, right? They have existence regardless of being observed. So I would say for us at this stage, this is more, these behaviors are more like phenomena. But also I think using Renzo's presentation, right? We really, what we care about are constraints and interactions more than signals. What we care about is like, what things do you have to fulfill in order to belong to some kind of movement? And what can you do when you're in that movement? So I think, yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer. I think it's an open question, really, like what is a behavior for us? But one thing it must have is that it needs to be composable. So given two behaviors happening at the same time, we ought to have some notion of whether or not they can be combined into a larger behavior.
What's an example of that?
Right. So,
or rather, what would be an example that would disqualify them? Maybe what? Yeah, if you could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you are, for example, eating pasta and then someone calls you on the phone and then you get up and answer the phone, now you're having a conversation, then your family might say, hey, you're interrupting dinner. Like, can you finish this conversation later? Like, that would be incompatible with having dinner, right? So you cannot say you can glue together eating pasta with answering the phone to form that type.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need to call upon a theory of psychology or of human communication or of like reflexes, the body, libido. You don't need to do any of that yet in terms of behavior. It's not really.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, I see what you're. Yeah. There is a lot of ideological like pitfalls, right, with this idea of behavior. Right, is like having a dream of behavior. Like there's a certain, maybe a psychoanalytic critique of behaviorism that is kind of in the background here, but no, yeah, for me, I'm not dealing with any of that. I'm just talking about the composition itself.
Yeah, I think it's also important. I mean, I understand what Daniel's coming from, because in psychoanalysis, there's this whole thing about critique of behavior in favor of, let's say, implicating the subject. The problem with behaviorism would be that it would account for why you do this rather than that, in terms of being conditioned to do this rather than doing that. So you never really get to inquire anything about freedom in any meaningful existential sense, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that's a very specific notion of behavior in psychology that's already a deturpation of a very general idea of behavior, which has more to do with, let's say, the costs that constraints put on possible paths, right? Which is a very general, doesn't need to apply to humans, can apply to particles in the vacuum, right? But then you want to sound scientific with your psychology, then you bring it in, right? And the more objective psychology looks, and less with subjectivity it gets involved, the more it looked scientific in the 20th century. So I think there's a whole ideological construct that doesn't really matter at this point. I wouldn't read that much into the term behavior, I would probably just, especially in the way that they use it, I would more take it as this kind of ingenious way of connecting action and, let's say, constraints, right? In a way that doesn't necessarily have to have a very strong normative kind of sense about it, right? In the sense that you have to have a clear rule of what you're doing. You can have, it seems more more loose in that sense, right?
Yeah,
So-
and that is actually part of the theory itself. Is it starts out very loose, but then you are, as the person who's doing the formalizing, you are the one who is supposed to add more constraints into what qualifies as a behavior that you care about as well.
Yeah,
So,
I think a nice thing
for
about
example-
behavior is thinking it in terms of characteristics of a system, right? You would say a system behaves in a certain way, it has a set of behaviors. So it doesn't need to imply much more than that, I think, unless you try to specify very neatly what you mean, right?
Yeah, and I do think this is compatible with psychoanalysis at a level. If you just tweak that idea a little bit. But yeah, we don't need to go into that. So yeah, there's two types of gluing that correspond to basically the pre-sheaf and the sheaf conditions that I just talked about. Right, one is called continuity gluing, which is to say that given any interval of time, for example, this S and T, right? If you pick out any sub interval, so some time period within the larger orange interval, it should be compatible with any other sub interval, right? So that's what this like equation basically means. It just means that the behaviors over S and T are isomorphic to the gluing of all of the sub intervals. So it doesn't matter which S prime and T prime you choose, there's going to be a way to glue it. Okay. And then the other type of gluing is called composition gluing, which is to say, okay, what if your sub interval, what if the two intervals don't contain one another, right? One is not contained in the other, but rather they have some kind of overlap. Then you need composition gluing, which is to say that these two intervals, they agree on some overlap, which is in this case, the green box. Okay, so like eating dinner, or sorry, eating pasta and washing the dishes. There is overlap there, which is, you could say, the time in which some people are still eating, but you're already starting to wash the dishes, right? But you're still having dinner technically in both, you know. So the overlap is something that you have to agree on. Once you agree on that overlap, then you can say, okay, then you're okay. You're part of this larger behavior which is occurring, right? So continuity and composition. The only difference is that in composition, there's a limited overlap that tells us what this kind of gives us a constraint, right? It doesn't really matter what you do before or after this overlap, as long as you agree on this overlap. Okay. And then there's one more technical thing that they have to deal with, which is, okay, let's say I'm doing something in time. What if I did that like 5 minutes later, right? So let's say I ate some pasta and I started at time S and I ended at time T. Well, it doesn't really make a difference if I do it at that time or I translate everything by some delta. So let's say like I ate dinner 30 minutes later than normal. Well, that doesn't really change the fact that I'm eating dinner, right? The type itself is not changed by the sliding of the time to sometime in the future, right? Although you could say, well, if I took longer to eat dinner, then that might actually be a different behavior type. So if S started at the beginning here, but T went all the way to T plus delta, right? Then you could say, okay, that maybe this is a different behavior type. But the actual translation of in the mathematical sense of moving this interval without changing the length of the interval, that should not matter. So a fancy way of saying is like types are sheaves over R modulo translation, meaning modulo just means we can ignore translations. And so the full description of this topos that they present is sheaves over R with this division sign, which means modulo, or ignore translations in time. And this is like a very fancy construction, even though it kind of says something very intuitive to us. This is the setting, the mathematical setting to relate these different behavior types together. Okay, so what can we do once we have this category of temporal behaviors? We can now formulate language based on this. And I'll show you examples. This looks a lot more intimidating than it actually is. But a language for type theory, or language for temporal type theory, is basically composed of some symbols, right? These symbols let us keep track of our statements. Lets us formalize constraints of different systems. So I don't need to go through all of them, but there's atomic types, atomic terms, and atomic predicates. Types are, I think someone before asked, like, what is a type? Basically, I think a good way to think of a type is basically like a set, except that they restrict the kinds of functions that you can do on that set. Whereas like a normal set function, it doesn't really matter. It can apply to any set given. Types say like, if you want to transform me into this other thing, you have to have the correct signature to do that. So I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, so I mean, in a production process, if you're trying to make a chair, a wooden chair, if I give you a bunch of iron or even like paper or something, you can't really turn that into a chair. You want a wooden chair, you need wood, right? So the type of the input matters. If I'm trying to buy a chair and I tell them I want a wooden chair and they present me with a metal chair, that's a type error, right? I'm saying that this is not the type of thing I want. So it's very much like a set, right? Because there's many kinds of chairs. There's many chairs in this set, but some of them have a type associated to them. And that's extra information we can use. And the reason these are called atomic is because we can make more types with the atomic types. So there are these things called type constructors, which given some input types, you can form more complicated types, which we can talk more about that later. Then there are atomic terms. Terms are things that have types. So they can include variables, which I didn't explicitly say, but this like little a is a variable of type big A. And functions can also be types, right? Functions can also be terms because they themselves have types. And relations can have types. By the way, this prop type stands for proposition. So it's almost like along with the types in your language, you also have the higher order type of prop if you want to say something about propositions in general. This is something that not all languages have, but in the case of this temporal type theory, they've simplified it so that you can make statements about statements, basically. And that simplifies a lot of the axioms, I think. And then you have these atomic predicates, which I think predicates are very there's a slight nuance here that when we talk about predicates in Badu a lot, a predicate is basically something that has the type of a prop. So given some input terms, it forms a proposition. That's all it is. And therefore, there's some debate on this, but relations can be considered as a kind of predicate. Because in relations, given some inputs, they create a proposition. Okay, so then we can kind of go further ahead. So these constructors, they allow you to make more terms out of older terms. This one is nice because it says like, given, we can construct from nothing the zero term, which is of type natural numbers. And given an element of any element of the natural numbers, we can construct a new number by applying this successor function to it, right? So this would be how you construct the natural numbers using this language. By the way, this thing is called a turnstile, this sideways T, and basically says like, give me some logical material and I'll give you some other logical material, right? So if it's empty, if there's nothing on the left, that means I'll give it to you for free. So I'll give you the number 0 for free. And then if you give me any other number, any number A, I'll give you another number, S of A. So it's a little machine, you know,
The
it's a
piano
logical
machine.
Yeah, it's a piano machine for making numbers. And usually on the left-hand side of this turnstile, we have something called a context, which is just a list of variables. That's just to keep track of your assumptions, basically. So and the context and the premise usually go together, right? The context is a list of variables, and a premise is some propositions that you already hold to be true. And given a context, so you can say that this is a true proposition. If you have this context and you have some premises, which are some propositions, you can produce a true proposition. And then combine two propositions with the and operator, P and Q. So I was eating pasta and watching TV, right? That's a proposition, but they can be separated, right? I was eating pasta, I was watching TV. Those are separate propositions. The other one is or, right? You're either eating pasta or you're answering the phone, right? And then this arrow to the right means implication, like whenever I'm eating pasta, I'm also watching the TV. So we can infer, we don't even need to ask, are you watching TV? Because if I know you're eating pasta, then Q is definitely true, right? So this is a distinct proposition, right? It's not the same as just saying I'm watching TV. It's saying if I'm eating pasta, then I'm watching TV. And then these last two give us the definition of, not the definition, but how we use universal quantifiers, universal and existential quantifiers. So you can say like this proposition holds for all x of type tau, or this proposition holds with type tau. This is kind of important, but I'm not going to go too into it. But yeah, universal quantifiers, they allow you to formulate like further conditions on your inputs. Like I'm only going to buy a chair from this store if they have a wooden chair. That's kind of an existence proposition, right? It's saying like there must be at least one wooden chair in the store, else I don't even bother going there. Which is different from saying all the chairs in the store are wooden. So it's a good place if you want to buy a wooden chair. Lorenzo, do you have a question? Or I don't know if Daniel.
I think Daniel had a question, no?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm sorry. I don't. I just need to take my hand down from the last question. My fault. Sorry, Dennis.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, no, I was just because it sounds like predicate logic
Mhm.
and set like the normal way, like you have the same sort of resources than logic with on set theory, but
Mhm.
is it the difference is that set theory is more like a more constrained space, and type theory like allows you to define these types, which are like, it's like in programming where you define like classes and you have like strings and floats and you are able to sort of like give rules to how this stuff relate.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just trying to understand like, yeah, what's the difference between set theory and logic to this?
Yes. Set theory is actually a restriction. So type theory is actually a generalization on set theory. Set theory is what's called a single sorted type. It only has one type, which is set. Everything in a set is the same type, basically. It's a set. I mean, even the elements of a set are sets, right? In
every chair is made of sets.
Yeah, every chair is made of sets. The things made of the sets are sets, and so on. Sets all the way down, right? Type theory stratifies things, right? It says like, okay, there are things that are like wooden chairs, for example. There are wooden things, and wooden chairs that you can stand on, like strong enough that you can stand on. That would be a subtype. So in some sense, it's very similar to a set, because you could say, well, isn't wooden chairs just a subset of wooden things? And there is a lot of correspondence there, but the benefit of the types is that we can put constraints on the type, on the functions and the predicates that work on this material.
The impression that I have is that it's the difference with set theory is that one is very absolutist in the sense that you're never allow a predicate to be the end, like say the brick of anything. If you arrived at a predicate, you can still always unpack it into the set of things, extensional set of things that fall under that predicate. And if those set of things are predicates, you should always go back to the extensional set of things. So it always goes back to set. And here it seems like it's okay if you cut it off at a level defined by predicates, right?
Yeah, actually, this is you brought up a good point. Is imagine I want to give you the type. Let's using set theory. I want to say, give me everyone at this street during a protest. Right, you're gonna get a list of individuals, but that is different from saying, give me everyone who's in the protest. Let's assume this protest is only happening on this street. Then extensionally, they might be the same thing, but the sense in which you want to speak of it are different, right? Which is why some people say that type theory is intentional, whereas set theory is extensional. So two different sets, if they have the same elements, they cannot be distinguished, right? But in type theory, they can. You can have the exact same elements within two types, but they're still totally different types. And if you still need sets, you can always specify a set as a type. So it's really, you don't lose that much by using type theory, except there's more kind of upfront, you have to kind of declare these things more explicitly. And really both, I mean, type theory was invented to avoid Russell's paradox. by saying like, okay, the set of all sets is not really a set. It's a different type. It's a class, right? So you can say the class of all sets, right? By creating that stratification between class and set, you've already introduced a minimal type theory. Okay. In the next section, we talk about, okay, now you have these like propositions, right? You have these terms, and you have this logical material that you've created. The sequent calculus is how you take logical material and you substitute or add or remove things to derive new statements. So there's actually an overlap between, you know, the constructors here and the proposition, creating new propositions. You can do the same thing with the sequent calculus. So an axiom, for example, given some premise, which in the case of an axiom, there's no premises required, you declare an axiom. Remember, the turnstile says, give me some stuff and I'll give you a proposition. But in this case, nothing's needed, so it's axiom. And you have these things called introduction rules, which given things of a certain two different types, like capital A could be like chairs, and capital B could be spoons. Then you can form this tuple, right, with composed of a chair and a spoon. It's a chair spoon type. Similarly, if you have a chair spoon, you can
Clearly it's a spooning chair though.
This spooning chair. It's a chair for spooning.
Yeah.
But you can also separate those types, right? If you have this elimination rule, you can say like, I don't really care about the spoon part. I just want the chair. So give me that. Or I only care about the spoon. Give me this.
Can I just do something? Just mention something, because since we're going into your reconstructing sequent calculus now, for us, it's like a lot of stuff. Just to make sure we don't lose the thing you said at the beginning, which makes all of this meaningful, which is if you accept that the way that behaviors, in the sense of actions and constraints, which are things out there in the world, that the whole pre-sheaf and sheaving thing on types and substrates, if those things hold, that means that it is meaningful to say that there is a language that is immanent to the way actions happen. Right? Then just to like, because we said like, pay attention to this crazy thing that, you know, the way types restrict parts of the actual space, right? You can actually recuperate the relation between the types from the relations between parts of the world. In this particular case, the relation between constraints or actions in the world. So like, it's really, 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 really taking far. And that's why we should be looking at these things. The idea that you can meaningfully talk about an immanent language to action, for example, which is not subjective, right? So these things which are, let's say, tools for logicians and very complex stuff suddenly becomes kind of connected to that other claim, right? Just to recall the context that, you know, turns Gansen into a communist.
Yes, it's definitely kind of a lot of details that we don't really need for that idea. Yeah, because really, like, the sequent calculus, it's invented for mathematicians to kind of derive new statements and kind of show that their logical system is coherent. And we don't really care so much, like, necessarily about consistency, unless that's like what you care about in your organization. But really, I'm introducing this as like a way to think about formalizing the constraints on different types of organization, right? Social forms, like we're talking about, which, you know, may or may not be measurable in the end. the goal that, so this is where we kind of depart from the actual paper, where the paper is a lot, tries to focus on this notion of like controlling systems. For example, in chapter 8 of that paper, they talk about, guaranteeing that, an airplane can take off and fly, safely when there's other aircraft in the air. And they use this language to guarantee that, right? You can, if you satisfy certain conditions, you can prove that an airplane can take off safely and land safely, which is cool and is very useful. And it's something we should also strive to understand, right? But it's not necessarily applicable directly to like a political movement. You're not necessarily trying to control everything as carefully as an airplane taking off, but it's still compatible, right? There's still systems that are logically coherent, and processes that are happening within a political movement. I think just opening that bridge is important between this kind of technical language and kind of more political actions. Okay, some other ideas they present is they actually, the internal language itself, even though it's called temporal type theory, it doesn't start out with time as a notion, right? You have to actually invent a notion of time. This is kind of, if you're like familiar with programming, it's kind of like creating your own like counter or your own tick, right? Imagine like you have a video game you're playing, and then like someone allows you to say like, you can speed up time in the game, right? That's kind of like an internal notion of time that you can tweak depending on what you care about. So in this case, there's a type called time, and it moves at a unit speed, right? Which is just considered whatever the normal speed of time is. And basically time, this equation down here, all it means is saying time is whatever moves at the unit speed. So it satisfies this predicate of unit speed. And in addition to that, they introduced this idea of like special operators. So these are shorthand for combining predicates, right? So if you, let's say you have a predicate called "there's sunlight in my room at time t," and you have another predicate that says "it is 8 p.m. at time t," then you can say phi 1 until phi 2. So there's sunlight in my room until 8 p.m. Right. So this is one way of like forming larger sentences, almost like natural language, right, about events and time. And then the very interesting, this is probably the most complicated, but actually I think kind of useful looking things. They're called modalities. So given a proposition, a modality is a way of turning that proposition into this a more complicated proposition. So let's say you have a proposition P, right, about something that's happening in the world. You can apply this pi operator to it, and that transforms it into this new proposition that says, for any time t, the proposition P holds for 0 length intervals. So if your proposition is it is raining, then this pi of P means that it is raining at every instant of time. So that's kind of like trivially true, right? If it's raining for an hour, then if you choose any moment in that hour, it's kind of trivially true that it's raining at that moment. But that's not necessarily true for other things like something which doesn't have a 0 length extension. For example, if you are the famous Zeno's paradox, right? Like if you're running if you're Achilles and the hare, right? You're or the tortoise and Achilles. If at a 0 length interval, movement stops, right? There's no movement. So to say that I am running from now until an hour from now, doesn't mean you can say I'm running at a 0 length interval within that time period.
Is it like saying like I asked a question during the class? It's true, but that doesn't mean that I asked the question during the whole class. Is that?
Yeah, that's similar. I mean, definitely that's not true, right? But even within the time period, let's say you started asking a question at time 0 and you ended your question at time 10, right? It took you 10 seconds to ask your question. This operator says that at every instant within that 10-second span, you are asking a question. So if I choose any instant in that time period, are you doing the thing that you said? Right, it's kind of an open question, right? Depending on how you want to set up your system. You could say, well, if you're asking a question between 0 and 10 seconds, then you must also be asking a question at 5 seconds, exactly. But you could also say, well, no, because the act of asking a question takes a duration. So asking a question requires some length of time. It's not something that can happen instantaneously. Right. So this modality is transforming a proposition to one which only zooms into that one instant. And it asks the same question, but for that instant. Okay, hopefully that is clear. And then this other modality, there's actually 4 modalities. I only put 2 here, but this one is saying either P holds or T is within some interval. So imagine you have something that is true except for a certain interval of time. For example, I'm always thinking about sheaves except for when I'm sleeping, right? So P, in this case, P would be I'm always thinking of sheaves, and the modality of this down arrow modality says except for this interval UD, right? Either it's this time interval or you're thinking about sheaves or whatever proposition is true. Right. I mean, all this stuff is just to approximate our way of talking about time and temporal events in natural language. More, it's to allow us to express that kind of thing, right? Sometimes you might say like I'm always either working or I'm sleeping, right? I'm always busy. That's kind of this modality. You know, the except, you know, unless you're sleeping, that's would be the way this is useful. All right, now we can get to the bombastic stuff, right? Given the temporal type theory presented earlier, we can kind of apply these ideas, and I haven't really gotten that far, honestly, in applying this because I spent so much time trying to understand the paper itself. But we can try to apply these ideas to capital, right? My first assertion here is that capital is something that happens over time, right? Capital is not a instantaneous phenomenon. It's not a atemporal thing. It's something that takes time, right? Marx himself has many references to time when he's describing these processes, right? The first being, right, the turnover time of capital itself, which last time, Renzo, you presented this nice diagram for, the difference between simple and expanded reproduction. But we didn't really talk about like how this is made concrete in like a given length of time. And usually,
and also, I think there's a difference because every time we mentioned time in the primer, we were taking an external view to the language of commodities, right?
yes,
Like logically, everything was actually simultaneous, right?
Mhm.
And the commodities could only, let's say, in their own language, say about the worth of something in this atemporal way. There wasn't a way of including into the sort of possible statements of the commodity world that they are temporally indexed in any way.
yeah. And that's always I feel like it's always the problem with formalization or math in general. It's whenever you try to bring time in, it's kind of not exactly the conception of time that we have, or, it's always missing some stuff. But I think this formalism goes pretty far in giving us tools that, normally you wouldn't have in like a more naive approach to formalizing this stuff, like this, like turnover time. So imagine like simple reproduction is a behavior type. So all the things that go into what we talked about last time, but buying labor power and means of production, putting them to work, right, consuming them in the act of production, taking that product and going and selling it, and then taking that money and then starting over again, right? That's all those actions together, just like eating pasta and watching TV or whatever, washing your dishes, they can be glued together, right? And we can show that by kind of decomposing the actions into their own subtypes. And we can say that there's this gluing that's happening, right? Just like with the sheaf, there's certain overlaps between different behaviors. And because there's an overlap, there's this notion of gluing them together. And as long as they agree, they obey some kind of conditions, we can start to compose these activities together. And we're composing them in such a way that they respect the time it takes. So this turnover time is really a crucial concept, right? Because it's the main thing that capital tries to get rid of or make shorter. And without a notion of time, we cannot really make sense of things like rate of profit and things.
Surplus extraction.
Yeah, surplus extraction in general, right? All these phenomena rely on time. Okay, so that's one area we can use this idea. And then the other one is, so we're a bit different because we also care about this like money, right? This ability to measure value in terms of money, which is how capitalism senses value. All right, we'll make a distinction along with Marx, right? The value is not the same as money. In this case, we're just saying money is like a sensor. It's a type of evaluate. It's a mechanism for evaluating things, but it's not value itself. So given the atomic type of time, we can add another atomic type called money or price, and we can start to formulate statements in terms of both time and money. And then this diagram here just basically says we can decompose this into individual types, right? Because this is a composite type. And the most interesting part of the paper, actually, I think, is in chapter 8, when they start to show these wiring diagrams, these systems, which have these ports sticking out of them. Each port represents some information that is either going in or out of that system. But unlike the interaction that Renzo proposed in this last this diagram here, what we care about is simply the constraints of the information. Does this information satisfy a constraint? So this is where all this crazy type language comes into play. Using this language, we can formalize the interface between a system and the outside world, right? In terms of this logical language. So we can attach to every port a contract that says, in order to communicate with me, you must satisfy certain constraints, which is symbolized by this phi symbol. And if you're able to satisfy these constraints, then we can connect together. So we can start to glue systems which obey their contracts.
Just to make sure I understand, like in this type language here, it says, given some context, like you need to give me this context so I can give you, so it can function as an input of some sort.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, if I'm a process that makes wooden chairs, you need to give me a certain amount of wood and a certain amount of labor power, and I'll give you chairs, a certain amount of chairs, for example. That's one example. Yeah. And let me think. Yeah, this is where the bombastic claim comes in, right? There is a debate among Marxists about the origins of value, or like, is value created in production, or is it kind of only really exists during exchange, and this kind of you could basically call it like, where does the whole system start, right? Where's the real source of things? And I think using this language of constraints and temporal type theory, we can actually make a more interesting claim, which is something to the effect of like, what if the value form is just the collection of constraints or the collection of interfaces that allow social reality to be composed in a certain way, right? So when you have like labor or an individual laborer, they have to do something to be adequate to the labor power that is exchangeable, right? You need to have certain, you need to work a certain way, you need to act a certain way in order to be even hired to do a job, right? And to keep your job. This like this conforming to a certain behavior, that is basically what how the value form shapes the various ports that we have, the way we interact, right? Because obviously the end goal is to make more money than you put in, extract surplus and so on. That's at a macro level. But what this language allows us to do is to trace how the macro constraint flows into the individual level, right? To whatever granularity, whatever zoomed in level we want, right? Which is something new, right? That we can have a type called simple reproduction, which can consist of thousands of steps across, thousands of people and machines, right? Simple reproduction is a massive, complicated thing that no one person can conceive of by themselves. But we can kind of zoom in and show that there are these individual types, these smaller types of behaviors that start to correspond to what we as individuals perceive, right? So there's this a way of basically carrying the constraints at different levels. carrying
And I
them
mean,
down.
the way you wrote it here even clarifies that it's nothing guarantees that simple reproduction is just pure production, right? It includes circulation and production and consumption, right? So
yeah,
when you see it from the perspective, it's clearer that asking is value an invariance that happens when you make two commodities equivalent in the market, or is value the thing that is, let's say, a property added to objects by labor? Those are, none of the two are very satisfying when you realize that there is no guarantee that a single process of production doesn't include circulation inside of it. Just think of supply chains and things like this. So what you're saying amounts to putting value at the level of, let's say, the sort of formal the informing that is needed to guarantee that there is actually some level of consistency across all these things, right? So that things can actually be, constraints can actually be conserved across all these things, no matter which one they are, right?
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be complete. Because one nice thing about composition is that you can focus on just an individual system. And as long as you specify the ports, you can really stop there and wait for someone else to formalize a different system and then see if those things connect. Instead of trying to specify what is the macro effect of some interaction, right? It may not be like, I don't know, I feel like in Marxist circles, there's kind of these debates that try to immediately connect local phenomena to global ones, like arguing about whether the rate of the rate of profit will fall over time. That's kind of a macro question, right? And then you spend a lot of time trying to prove that
at the level of a firm.
Yeah, at the level of a firm, which it may be that for a single firm you'll never see their rate of profit fall, right? And it's almost like a meaningless question because the scale is not being taken into account at which that statement is relevant. So this diagram here is kind of my attempt at doing kind of what Marx already does in Capital, where he kind of describes like how these firms start to interact, right? So what we have here, two departments or capitals that take in variable capital and constant capital, and they produce some product. And maybe the product of one becomes the input constant capital for the other, right? And then maybe there's this population of laborers, which doesn't really belong to the system of capital immediately, but they are kind of subsumed because they need to consume the product of one of the departments, and they're forced to sell their labor on the market. So then this outward port is labor power, and becomes the variable capital of the first two, right? So this is how you would wire these systems together, and then maybe this whole system is actually it's not closed, right? It's not a closed system necessarily, because it needs to attach to other systems for further, right? Because it's rare that a set of laborers will only rely on one company for their consumption. They may need consumption from various different sectors. So you can kind of build pieces of capitalism with this language, and each one of these ports they obey some kind of constraint, the constraints that we can formalize with this language. Yeah, so that really the bombastic claim here is that the value form is a behavior contract. It's a behavior contract that's composable and also takes into account time as a time component to it.
Yeah, I feel like the time component, I mean, you could have made the argument about this sort of value form as, you know, the criteria for something to be properly typed in capitalism, right? It's the process of abstracting in the sense of forming something into a meaningful input, right?
Yes.
I think like that argument can be made regardless of whether these meaningful types, so these well-formed types, they include resources to, let's say, relativize things, localize things in time, which I think they do. I think it seems like it's a relevant thing to say that, you know, we went as far as saying in the primers things like, you know, if you have a commodity, it's expressible in single commodity terms, that other commodities are equivalent or more or less equivalent to the commodity you have, right? And if you have money, then actually it's expressible in money language more than that, because you can also express specific proportions between the commodities, more commodities than your own and the one you can exchange with, right? You can kind of see a sort of organized or ordered degrees of exchangeability. And if you have capital, you can see more than that. In the language of, if I have some capital, money that I want to make into more money, I can actually tell commodities apart in terms of, well, if I consume this commodity, will it give me more value than it's worth or not? But all those are properties that are not temporally typed, right? There's not a matter of if I consume it now, right? Or if it's consumed if the whole process of consumption takes place in this short time, then it will give me a return. If it takes longer than this will not give me a return, which is definitely something capital is sensitive to, right?
Exactly.
So I think that that's definitely an addition, though that part of it, like, I get the general feeling of the usefulness of adding temporal types to this language, because it seems intuitively to me that capital has that resource. But one of the things we managed to do with money and money especially was that we found a way of, let's say, pulling that resource from the very material of money, right? So, well, when money is a commodity that you can divide it into pieces and it remains the same commodity, suddenly you can express in relations of one commodity to itself the relation between that commodity and parts of other commodity, right? So it seemed like we pulled that new resource from something that is internal or very close to that world. There was something fuzzy we did, something messy we did when we tried to show that this also is valid for socially necessary labor time, which I think it's a cool thing we started doing, which is showing that, well, in some sense, it's once you have money, you can look into labor time and organize it just the way you organize money, right? In a very strong analogy. But even there, we didn't really pull from this sort of temporal development the resources to say, well, that's why, once you have labor and consumption and people are alive, suddenly the time it takes to make things actually matters, right? For commodities. So there is some step there to make it a similar step to the one we made with money. There's something missing that I would have to be thought through, why would this be a resource? I mean, we know this matters for capital turnover time, but does capital know it? And how is this, let's say, articulatable solely with the resources of the commodity world, right? It surely has something to do with labor and the fact that laborers are trapped between consumption and production, and that's where I would probably look into to find something similar to the problem of equivalence and the homomeric property, right? But almost like what would be the formal use value that would allow us to introduce into that machinery, the claim that it is sensitive to time, other than because capitalists are sensitive to time. So there's something there I'm still unclear, but regardless of that, which I think it's a added thing, like it's much clearer to me now that, I mean, it's something we've been looking into for a long time, and it's still an intuition we haven't really developed that far, which is this idea of scale, resolution. Now it seems to me that you're showing that, well, this connection between logic, types, and space, right? Like the whole algebraic topology stuff, mixed together with the type theoretic stuff, it brings together very closely, very, very neatly, this idea of types and the whole more mereological stuff we were looking into. So it confirms even further that that's where we should be looking if we want to understand how like resolutions matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it also confirms, which I think it's very good, that we were right to be suspicious that the whole kind of cybernetic and the whole structuralist traditions, which talk a lot about formal relations, abstract relations, or about machines, they don't really have the resources to explain what needs to happen for something to become a proper input to a machine, right? You can have like a whole Deleuze and talk about machines and cybernetics and whatever, but they never get to tell us what labor or what conditions go into a sensor sensing some things rather than others, right? Why does this difference make a difference and not that difference, right? And I feel like this is also bringing us much closer in that sense. Like there's much more resources here to make that distinction, exactly as you were doing in the beginning with the examples of, sure, you can localize some type into a situation in terms of everyone wearing black, but that's not enough for you to, let's say, be able to port that type into an interactive system, right? It needs to abide to other conditions to be a type that is, a proper input to a whole set of interactions that actually consist together, right? So it does seem also to make more sense that this is a correct intuition, that we should be looking for an answer to that question, right? I think it appeared in Renzo's presentation as well, when he showed very nicely that the whole interactive graphs he constructed, for example, captured properties of how kinship relations are structured, like mother, son, father, the different kind of relations between them. But we couldn't really answer the question, but why are kinship relations relevant in mode A then? Like, why are these the types, right? And I feel like that's always something we're getting closer to as like a serious question, what sort of abstracting, like in an active way, right, or kind of a practical way, needs to take place for some set of action, some set of constraints, some whatever, to be formed into something that can actually enter into meaningful relations with other parts of the system, right?
Yeah. And in addition to that is like the ports of a system are not necessarily fully defined. Like it might end up being that the type that you think is an input for something may not be the same as what it actually is capable of receiving, right? So like just thinking about the thesis of extending your individual sensibility, right? Your individual sensibility is like it takes a certain type of information, right? Certain only, let's say, things that you can sense with your body.
Yeah, it takes literally like time intervals, space intervals, frequency, like very specific register, right?
Right. Yeah. That you're formed you're formed to make. But then there's ways to augment that, right? And one of our primary thesis is that an organization is like a extra sensor, right? It can sense things that you individually cannot. So in that way, like ports and types are not fully specified, or maybe you can say that, you know, there are processes which can add ports or change the types of a port. In addition to what you're saying about, you know, modifying yourself to conform to a certain behavior contract.
Yeah, because I think that this is ultimately where we could, you know, like, I feel like the ultimate step in what you're saying when you mentioned this debate with Marxism today, which is, I mean, the debate for today and the last 40, 100 years, perhaps, over, okay, first, is value form that meaningful, or is it just a secondary term due to the fact that their commodities have value, right? Value form seems just to be the sort of way of talking about the fact that they have value, and then you can ask, okay, is this value, commodities worth $10 because I went to the market and I could only change them for $10 because nobody would accept less, and then this becomes the beacon for people in production. Well, I need to do it such a way that things are worth this much. Or is that determination coming from labor and the relation between time, labor, and objects, the social conditions of production in a moment? And then when I get to the exchange, I will confirm or disprove, but I'll just make it express something that actually was determined elsewhere, right? And it's interesting because that's actually the language of where is it determined and where is it expressed, right? Yeah. And that's very much the two languages, the two sides of the one thing that's happening here. Interaction has a lot to do with determination. Constraints have to do with determination, but types and language have to do with expression. Mm-hmm. And now the two things are the same.
Yeah.
So you no longer need to divide it into, okay, perhaps in exchange, value is expressed, but it's determined in production, or the inverse. It's determined in exchange, but expressed in terms of time, because that's what now laborers and managers are kind of running after that determination, right? And perhaps that there's a way of kind of explaining what's the difference with this approach, because abstraction becomes the two things at once, right? We are no longer concerned with how things are expressed for us. We're concerned with how they are expressed for other commodities. So we free up expression from the problem of where do we see value, right? It becomes more obvious about people measure, like measure is evaluated at every point of the production and circulation process, right? Managers are evaluating the value of things, the value of laborers' time, the value of the means of production being used, right? So you can actually have a theory of how these things are getting expressed all the time. You don't need to have a theory of how these things are only expressed when we see value appear, like in the price tag, right? Or in the toil of the worker. So I don't know, there is a way of kind of putting forward this alternative thesis, which I'm still like, I understand what you mean by it's kind of ports, and something needs to be kind of properly formed to connect, right? It goes back to the whole Sheaf thing, that it's not enough to find the unit, to find the relevant kind of resolution for analysis. The relevant resolution also needs to come with, let's say, the added condition that it connects with other relevant resolutions, right? But how to formulate this in a way that is clear for Marxists, you know? I think that that's still the...
Yeah, because it isn't the whole idea like moment of production and moment of exchange kind of already presupposing the individual standpoint, right? That the fact that you can only be in one moment at a time. So you're either standing in the factory or you're standing in the store,
it's true.
right? So it's very centered on the individual perspective. But the nice thing about these behavior types is like they can be extended across vast, time. It doesn't really matter like the duration, right? It's still one type of activity, and really like that's a lot of things, right? A lot of processes are extended beyond an individual standpoint, and we can only perceive a slice of that.
Yeah, but now that I think of it like because of course then people will say, well, but how do I select the appropriate scale of analysis? And I think that now that I think of it, I think the perhaps the strong argument that ties everything together is that, well, this clarifies that you should be looking for the organizational, because right, I think this is kind of one of our undeveloped underlying thesis, which is, well, what organizations do is that they abstract in reality, right? When you organize people, some things start mattering more than others. And the interactive approach was a really good way of, that Renzo was proposing, was a really good way of showing that, well, depending on how things interact, some things will appear as being part of the same interior, and some things will appear as external to that, right? This whole thing here in the screen right now is another way of saying that this thing here is getting abstracted from this thing here, right? Like in the more active sense of forgetting, or emphasizing some difference, that difference makes a difference in opposition to other differences that make less a difference, or things get kind of bundled up, right? So once you accept that idea, you would want to understand abstraction of value in an organizational sense. And then from the organizational point of view and not the point of view of individuals, it makes no sense to separate circulation and production as if you're either here or there. The whole point is that our production and circulation are organized, right? So it stands to reason that it's the thing that makes a difference needs to be kind of shared by both moments of one organizing process, right? Like it clarifies, like this kind of value organization theory, which is a region of a broader theory of organization, clarifies that the proper standpoint to look at value is always the standpoint which is allowing it's allowing the organization of production, circulation, and consumption to be coherent, right? No matter what that level is, right? And then we would call value that kind of how do you call it, like establishment of that particular point of view, right? Well, you're doing things here very faster than your competitor. Things are coming to the market too quickly, whatever. Well, the point of view of preserving value or valorizing value is the point of view which will think your production as already from the standpoint that it needs to be sold later on. So properly formed parts of this production now need to be ready to be connected with that retailing side of the process on the other side, right? It's like, so the interactional, the type, and they really do bring us closer to like a meaningful theory of value as something that is organizing, right? And not like a transcendental thing outside of the world or something like that, while still being abstract.
Exactly. And I think the ultimate point of this direction is to say like the value organizational perspective is a limited one, right? It's a limited one that's only able to glue together so much. It can't glue everything, right? It only glues together the stuff that's meaningful for capitalism. But for example, we've been talking about like Anthropocene or climate change and things like that. That's actually a bigger perspective, right? That's the
Mhm.
perspective of org, maybe more of org or more thing. And in which case you can then think of like capital itself is only one of the subtypes that is glued with some other larger type, right? Which maybe we could call speculatively like social reproduction or metabolism, right?
Yeah.
To use that metabolic rift theory stuff, right? These are attempts to try to glue this phenomenon to something larger, but our addition to this idea is like you need this organizational form that's capable of doing that work.
Yeah, I have the impression that, the place to introduce time in the primer would be exactly the place that you had the intuition here, which is simple reproduction, because it's the first time that capital relates to itself, right? For capital to remain capital, it needs to go through the whole cycle and return to itself to be used again, right? It's not like a single cycle thing. It needs to go again. And more than that, like it's the point of connection to time and space, because Marx says, well, there is no simple reproduction. There's only expanded reproduction. It's impossible for you just to take the money and invest it back. Everything not changing, because this is not feasible. You need to make more money. You need to increase your growth, and that implies that other companies around you are also increasing, and that there are more laborers coming in, and so on, right? So the first standpoint that we have, where one single thing relates to itself through a cycle, it's actually capitalist reproduction. We never get laborers relating to themselves as a cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
So that would be like where probably we get the stuff to add kind of a cyclical notion of time in capital into the language of capital, right? And what the reason why I'm saying this is because, well, if there is some temporal resolution to capital, which is turnover time for individual sector capitals, all the way to total social capital, right? That probably we could show that resolution is never big enough to include deep time of the earth. That's not a meaningful temporal resolution, right, for capital.
Yeah.
So like it would be a nice explanation as to why it's impossible from the standpoint of capital to be sensitive to, let's say, the fact that children in a couple of generations will have problems with air pollution in a level that is unthinkable, and that this might actually get in the way of capitalist production, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's the direction. It's that I mean, every resolution here corresponds to a type or a set of types, and then to that we add the organizational trinitarianism thing. I think is nice, because it's basically saying like every type also connects to some form of organization that's able to sense it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the part where that I said that I think we're getting closer to that more than we ever were, but it's still hard to pinpoint, which is, I can see today, I think you made clearer the connection between types and interactions. So it's the intelligibility side with the interactive side. But the fact that things need to be put together in some way for some types to be, ready for some types of interaction, right? So not some types need to be ready, but that some things suddenly are now counted under that aspect rather than a meaningless one, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes a lot through this idea that the organization is abstract. Like, or in that sense, right? We could say something like, in the same way that Renzo was analyzing these processes of interaction to say, well, this brings all these things closer together, moves that thing apart. There should be like a weaker version of that, where we could say, well, putting all these people together or removing from them means of production, that creates something which we call, for example, labor power as a type that can be fed into production process, right? Like you don't want to hire a person who knows how to do a specific type of chair, only that specific with their signature, right? That's not properly typed. You want the guy who is a carpenter. Even if it's a specialist in making chairs, there is some abstracting from doing that specific chair to doing chairs, right? It's a practical thing. It's an organizational thing. You need to be able to interact with things in some way, but it's also some sort of precondition for him to actually serve as the input to something in the production process, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. Training your types. Like,
yeah. And I mean, of course, yeah, I would say it's probably circular, right? I mean, this is like the chapter on primitive accumulation, where Marx is pretty much saying, like, you know, nothing like being very hungry to suddenly discover you can do anything.
mm-hmm.
So that's a typing process, right? Finding out that you can sell. I mean, that's actually the type to serve as an example for this, that losing the means of production creates for Marx, like unemployment is a condition for the labor power as an abstract, indistinct capacity to emerge. But labor as an indistinct capacity that can be compared with the work of others, you know, that can be sliced up in terms of temporal units. I'm not counting if I'm putting you to use as a carpenter or as a machine operator or whatever. It's just labor, right? Labor didn't always exist as a predicate of actions. You couldn't say what he's doing, he's working. That didn't mean anything, right? You didn't single out anything. But once you're not a carpenter, you don't have the tools to do anything, and you're just selling your time, suddenly labor power existed, right? It's a historically situated capacity, the capacity of selling your labor in this abstract sense, right? So like that chapter on the primitive accumulation kind of gives the story of changing the organization of society that kind of informs people's activities in such a way that a new activity was born. The activity called just working, right? Where I'm not selling a capacity or a particular quality of mine. I'm selling my time indistinctively, and then it's applied in different ways according to whoever has the means of production. I think that's a really good example of what I'm trying to talk about. Like some set of constraints, social constraints, they actually really abstracted, right? Through dispossession, people into producing something called indistinct labor capacity, right? Or labor power as this sort of abstract thing.
And Renzo has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, no, it was, let me lower my hand first so I don't talk with my hands raised. Yeah, this type, the temporal and the type thing being put together in this context of behaviors, which ties to interaction, really started to click a bit with me now. Like on the temporal side, I think it helps. It came to my mind a lot. Like I've been working with Markov chain models in which you have like this iteration rules that guide like behavior, and you can compute like stationary distributions, which are basically like in these Markov models, you have an initial state in which you say like, you could say like in an economy, you can imagine like different firms and different people starting with different amounts of like resources. And then given an initial configuration, you can sort of iterate and see where the system goes in time. But there's this thing called like an stationary distribution, which is, you can compute, is like this ideal limit in which there's an equilibrium distribution, which more or less says, okay, if given this constraint, dynamical constraints, you end up with this sort of like distribution of goods. But it's interesting because there is this sort of tension between the initial conditions and the equilibrium distribution. And like I've actually struggled a bit with that, because depending on how like you impose initial conditions, and depending on how you impose coarse grainings, and also like the number of iterations you perform, you can end up with different the amount that the stationary distribution will correspond to like reality can change a lot. Like you can start with different goods and not necessarily reach the stationary distribution, or you can instead of computing the stationary distribution for like infinite time, you can compute it just for like, so for a certain scale which is relevant. And then there's also the matter of like how much you coarse grain the system. So I don't know, it's just something that came to my mind, which I think it's like this concept, like, and I think it ties, because I feel like that the way that you think about like value and it being like a sheaf, you've talked like before in terms of value being this sort of equilibrium, like this sort of, right? I don't remember like the term you use, but like this chain in which things sort of like coalesce around, and you can sort of like walk through the whole like network. So it has this, and I think it ties to the also like the game aspect, right? Which we're saying that could tie, like, because strategies sort of like in games depend on how like the scale of how many like players you're taking into account, like the time that you have, and it is also always intentional with like the empirical like a stretch, like a equilibrium is always like intentional with the actual like empirical way that things kind of unfold. So I don't know, I think the way that you sort of like putting everything, all of this together, sort of like started to click in this more like broader sense, this temporal dimension and the way that value can, so you can think about crisis in this way, that you have like this contradiction between the empirical trajectory and the sort of like idealized equilibrium distribution, I think. And the second thing is related to the more type thing that I think is really, can be really helpful. Like, I think that part I was talking about gestures is this type thing can really help to capture, which is like I was like with this thing that Gabriel mentioned about abstraction, like organizing is a way to abstract. I think it's there's a sort of like inverse relationship between the amount of types you can hold and how much it can abstract, it can survive composition and sort of abstraction. And so, right, the original definition of composition is that which where no emergent effects occur, right? And so you, in a sense, having like a really like thin and simple protocol that is what it takes to sort of be able to survive a change in scale. So for example, and I think like talking about gestures was a bit my way of saying about this sort of like minimal behavior in which you have no guarantee of having a type, because a gesture is something like singular. So like you have like face expressions, like or like gossip and face expressions are really rich protocols. It's a really like, you have many types, right? When you like use facial communication, you have like sad face, and it's really like subtle and complex. So you can say it's like a language with many types. But that's, if you try to scale that, if you try to think about like crowds of people trying to communicate by like expressions, it gets lost in noise. Because, so I think there's a really deep trade-off between the amount of types you can hold and how much these types can sort of be compositional. So
yes, that's definitely
right?
That's a huge thing. Yeah, that I think that's the most directly important thing for organizing, because we always talk about, oh, organization enhances your sensibility, right? But we haven't really talked enough about how it also eliminates a lot of sensibility as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's like a common, I mean, all the critiques of authoritarianism and kind of this, like, this, you know, the criticisms of the state and taking state power, I think you can translate them into, like, what about the types that don't survive? The types of things that aren't composable but are valuable, you know, don't they get eliminated? You know, I would say like anarchism is almost like this clinging on to the richness of types, and now, you know, like anarchists are always hesitant for any composition because it's gonna erase some type out there, some type of resolution will go away. So
yeah, but I think that this is exactly the point where the things you showed today and the things we've been working change a lot. Because, for example, you can say that, you know, for example, I walk in a crowd and I see many faces, many different people, and so on. Okay, for me, all those predicates are expressible, relevant. I can access them and I can speak about them. Collectively, none of them exist. None of them make a difference to anything, right? The things that are constraining people and interacting with people socially, like the streets, the walls, to urban planning, police, social rules, they don't care, like, oh, you're wearing a red shirt, you go here. You're not wearing a red shirt, you go there, right? They're very coarse. The things that they do sense are things like different colors, different genders, and that's pretty much it, right? And wealth possessions. If you have money, if you're Black, right? If you're a trans person, so on, like, it's very poor, even though for me, it's very rich. So when you collectively organize, the idea is that, well, it's not for you that things will increase or decrease, though that might be the side effect, right? You're suddenly organized with a bunch of people and those things stop mattering, or you're suddenly looking over some differences. That's a whole important aspect of it, but it should be part of the story, because the crucial part of the story is that we should be able to develop the sensibility to say, yeah, but from the standpoint of social interaction, where it's not about how people are individually interact, but how organizations are interacting, now some things that didn't matter do matter, right? I think the totalitarian argument, it implies that you don't have those two levels of analysis, right? It implies that there's only one level, like, because it's, for example, the Marxist critique is that it's very fine that you think you live in a democracy. You don't, like, in the sense that socially, none of this different predicates actually matter, right? So if we don't have a way of describing an enrichment or a transformation of how many more things are expressible or how many more differences make a difference from the organizational point of view, we're always trapped in, let's say, the thermometer of, you know, uniformization or differentiation that happens for us individually, right? So I see what we've been discussing actually contributing a lot in that, though I totally agree with you that it's definitely also the case that, for example, a lot of political agendas in the left have a lot to do with types not mattering, right? So who enters this building or doesn't, or who feels safe here or doesn't, shouldn't be distinguished. We want more indifference, right?
yeah, that's a good point. That actually indifference to types is a positive thing. It's not so much like, oh, you're erasing all these like important differences.
Yes,
no,
exactly.
Social reality is already sensitive to social differences in a way that's marginalizes people. And it's actually, most movements are about, you know, trying to correct that or at least counter that somehow.
Yeah, but you see, like, I think that we suddenly have two sets of new tools, like two axes to work with. The first is, are you sure you're analyzing if differences make more or less difference from the right perspective? Because one thing is for them to make a difference individually or for people, and another thing is for them to make a difference socially, right? And there can be weird trade-offs in those things where things stop mattering so much individually, but they make more difference socially, for example. Then there's the other axis, which is this one where sometimes political objectives are connected to making new differences make a difference. Like we shouldn't think that things are going well if we're totally destroying the environment, right? That should make inherent difference to economic decision making, and not in the sense that somebody is a great poor soul, a pure soul that is taking that into consideration, but the system itself shouldn't work if that's going badly, right? It's propagating that signal everywhere. Or the inverse, like some things should stop making a difference, right? So those two axes become very relevant. I don't think it takes anything away from what Renzo said, that the moment that you take this problem of, which for Badiou is the whole problem of atomic composition, right? Like, yeah, you need to localize and be compatible. And well, if you want to be able to recompose something from the ground up by gluing things together, it looks like very rich spaces actually are much more prone to emergent effects and inconsistent composition, right? Though I'm not sure if composition, I mean, I've heard that definition before, but I'm not sure if we need to abide by the idea that composition equals, you know, gluing things with no emergent effects.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it requires that we not have emergent effects. I think it just means, I think the uniqueness condition is more important, that it's like the same effect if you're gluing the same over the same overlap or something like that.
Yeah, I would like to know more about that, because I've heard that before. Usually I hear that coming from people who are using category theory for more for computational purposes, where, you know, it's all about making sure you're not doing something crappy with your programs and so on. So not having emergent effects and guaranteeing that things are, let's say, you can zoom in and out and you're still looking at the same thing, right? It's very important. Like, whereas, for example, in capitalism, there are problems where meaningful predicates change depending on how close you are, right? Like value, production prices, things like that, right? You can lose track of something. Capital does lose track of itself, right? As we've seen many times, this idea that, well, when you zoom out from a single production process, the minimal unit of the place where you came from might get lost, right? And now you need to redescribe things in a different way. Remember that sort of idea of like you have something local, and then you get like a synthetic point of view, but from this synthetic point of view, now the pieces actually look different than from where you started, and then you synthesize them again, and now it looks slightly different again, right?
Right.
So there's still some synthetic condition going on that you need to abide to, but it allows for immersion stuff in some sense. But anyway, that's a very interesting debate to have. I know it's late and we're pretty much, Andrea is the only other person left here. Everyone else,
Brave survivor, yeah.
a brave survivor. So yeah, it's probably a better discussion to have some other time. But I think it's interesting to see that all these things kind of start falling into place together. You know, this difference versus indifference, but also what counts as the sensor of difference and indifference, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think this language is just to make concrete some of the intuitions we already have been talking about this.
Yeah, but this was so cool, man.
Yeah, thank you all for sticking with it and tolerating these slides of undecipherable stuff.
No, it was much less undecipherable than I expected. I mean, it's the first time you actually went into this kind of cut elimination sequence stuff, right?
Yeah, I actually kind of almost understand it, but it's kind of tedious for sure.
Yeah. It's the first time many stuff start to make sense to me. Like
Yeah, to me too, man. I think that's really
Sheaf and
important.
Sheaf, like
Yeah, man, you're getting so good at the sheaving thing. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, how many times am I going to revisit it before it's like really clear?
No,
Hopefully I
it's
can explain it to like kids before.
no. I think you're definitely in that direction. Hey
Yeah.
kids, today we're gonna talk about cuts and glue, and everyone, yes,
Yeah.
but not that story you're thinking of.
Yeah, that would be nice.
I think the hard thing to understand in like category theory and type theory, because they're so general and like universal, is like when you understand, you say, because like my initial reaction, so it's just like set theory. And it is like it can completely like reobtain everything that you already know. So just like saying it is what I already know is something, but it's not enough because it's something broader, right? So is this weird sort of like enlargement in which you don't feel a difference because it just looks like stuff that you already know, but you suddenly have more room to sort of like do stuff because it's less constrained. So it's so
I was telling Dennis I have a real problem accepting that this is useful because I really don't want Russell to be right in anything. So, like I was so much like the Hegelian guy saying, haha, Russell's paradox. Lacan was, this is so crucial. And suddenly like this really useful thing starts with, no, let's take the opposite route now. Let's take the conservative route. No contradiction.
yeah, I remember the first time I read that, so Russell fixed it by just like, okay, there are two levels, there are like classes and sets, and I was like, okay, that's cheating. That's like so
exactly. It feels like that. It does feel like that.
But it makes, now that I think of it, I mean, in my head I separate this from Russell. Like he definitely didn't interpret it in this way, but the more, I mean, the deeper we go into this whole scale resolution idea, there is something that it is meant to be arbitrary, which is exactly what we said. Like it's arbitrary to divide sets and classes, but resolutions are very weirdly a logic of what moves with this particular type of arbitrary transformation, right? You want to hierarchize, like create a hierarchy between these two types of things. Well, something follows from that, right? So something that looks very capricious, once you have like a general theory of this, right? So you have many types, okay, but what does this mean? If you regionalize, like if you restrict, if you don't restrict, if they go together, they don't go together. Suddenly, the very thing that looked arbitrary seems to be now theorized,
Yeah, it is. It has that constructive flavor of putting pieces together that are normally abstracted away, I think.
I also feel like I'm a bit less, I mean, the triad of things that I don't like, honestly, like for a general theory, I'm fine that they are very useful, but I don't like them to be like where you start from, is this connection between types, construction, and computability. Like, I know this is like the cornerstone of the world right now, but deep in my guts, I cannot accept that this is, let's say, the best way to think about things other than where computation is directly meaningful,
Yeah, I think this is also, that's I think this is why Badiou kind of stopped short in category theory and like.
Yeah, exactly. I really think that that's a really big thing. Like he knew, like if you go far enough in this, people just say, yeah, so constructivism, it's all about computation, Breuer, and so on. And I feel like once we came up with this organizational point of view, it's not about, like, it seems like it's a slightly broader view, and those can be the best tools to talk about it, but it's not like committing to that as a fundamental thing,
Yeah, I think once you add that organizations, you need an organization to sense types. It's no longer this like, oh, you made a type in a computer and that's what counts as a type. It's like, no, types are concrete. Like they're more concrete than that. They're like social social phenomena.
Yeah,
even.
and I mean, that's exactly where Badiou would add subjectivity back. He will say, yeah, but it takes subjective political work, for example, to form new differences into a system. So you don't want to cut off before that has done its part, you know, in conditioning something. I'm more ready to accept that, you know, this weird, heroic, strange, vague thing we don't understand that he associates with infinity and so on, that it works at these boundaries in a very weird, generic sense, right? And once that thing is done, sure, type computational constructive approaches are the best for things that are settled into some systemic approach. But I wouldn't want this to be I feel like once you set yourself in that realm, no, you can no longer speak about this more underground activity, which is where, you know, subjectivity is really at stake. Like, you can't really account for things if you remove subjectivity there, you know?
Yeah, this is something we need to talk more about. Like,
Yeah, anyway, let's go. Even Andrea left us now, so
yeah, we've gone too far now.
Well, now we're going too far. See you guys. Sleep well.
Yeah. Did you guys send the atlas to Badiou? Just a curiosity.
No, since we never answered our other emails, I don't think we did.
Yeah, we could though. That's not a bad idea.
Yeah, we know we're
Might like
planning
it.
to send him like some questions for an interview in writing, right? Like about the work that we're doing right now. So I probably could send with the atlas, like, we wanted to invite you for an interview. Here's what we've been doing. Would you accept an interview? You know, something like that.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can
that'd be really
also use another email just to like, it feels it's like right from
Another
different
person.
emails.
Yeah.
A good idea, yeah.
It's the same person like annoying him.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, but let's think about that. Okay, guys, I need to run.
Okay. Take care.
See ya. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Bye.